At 7:15 inches the morning on the 8th of July, 1944, a young soldier named Guy Gabaldon stood at the bottom of what would come to be known as Banzai Cliffs on the island of Saipan. His eyes fixed on the dark openings of caves where hundreds of Japanese troops had taken refuge, many of them considering taking their own lives. He was only 18 years old. Behind him lay 2 successful captures of enemy prisoners. Around him, nobody to help. Just the night before, the Japanese forces had thrown themselves into a banzai charge that went on for 15 brutal hours. That suicidal assault had claimed the lives of 4,000 Japanese soldiers. Those who made it through alive had pulled back into volcanic caves carved into the cliffside. The American officers knew what was coming next. The enemy troops would either die fighting or end their own lives rather than be taken prisoner. Guy stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall. His body weight was only 130 pounds. In his hands he held an M1 carbine. Strapped to him were 4 hand grenades, and in his mind, a rough, imperfect version of Japanese he'd picked up on the streets of East Los Angeles. Most of the Marines stationed on Saipan had never laid eyes on a Japanese prisoner of war. The soldiers of the Imperial Army fought with a level of commitment that bordered on fanatical. Their officers had drilled into them that the Americans would brutalize them, violate their families, and defile their remains. To surrender was to accept a disgrace far worse than dying. The Bushido Code left no room for debate. Death was honorable. Capture was not. By the time early July of 1944 rolled around, the 2nd Marine Division had already lost 3,000 men fighting on Saipan. Japanese defenders chose death over surrender again and again. Civilians leapt from cliff edges, clutching their children. Gabaldon himself had witnessed hundreds of lifeless bodies being pulled in by the tide after mass deaths at Marpy Point. Guy was born in the city of East Los Angeles on the 22nd of March, 1926. He was the 4th child in a family of 7. His father made his living as someone who built boxes and worked with machines. The family called Boyle Heights home, one of the most impoverished areas of the entire city. By the time Guy turned 10, he was shining shoes down on Skid Row. He ran small jobs for women who worked in the bars along Main Street. Police officers would hand him candy in exchange for information about what he witnessed after dark. When he reached the age of 12, he went to live with a family named the Nakanos. 2 Japanese-American boys, twins named Lyle and Lane Nakano, had been his closest friends from school. It was the Nakano family who taught him their language. Not the formal, polished kind. This was street-level Japanese, the sort you'd hear spoken in back alleys and corner shops in Little Tokyo. It was rough around the edges, straightforward and loaded with slang. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. After that, the United States government forced the Nakano family into the internment camp at Hart Mountain. Guy enlisted in the Marines on the 22nd of September, 1942. During recruitment, he managed to convince them he was fluent in Japanese. The truth? He wasn't, but he knew just enough to make it work. Following boot camp, the Marine Corps assigned him to the enlisted Japanese language school located at Camp Elliott in San Diego. From there, he was placed with headquarters and service company, 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division. His role? Scout and observer. The Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan on the 15th of June, 1944. The initial wave brought 8,000 Marines ashore. Japanese artillery ripped through their ranks as soon as they hit the sand. Guy wore a baseball cap and a pair of aviator sunglasses. He thought the look made him resemble John Wayne. Just 2 nights after the landing, Guy slipped out of camp without asking for permission. Near a cave, he came across 3 Japanese soldiers. In Japanese, he ordered them to lay down their weapons. One of them lifted his rifle instead. Guy shot him. The remaining 2 put their hands up. He marched them back to camp. His commanding officer, a man named Captain John Schwabe, threatened to have him court-martialed for leaving his post. The very next night, Guy went out again. He found another cave. He shot the guard standing watch. Then he lobbed a grenade inside. After that, he shouted into the darkness in Japanese that they were completely surrounded and had no other option but to give up. 50 Japanese soldiers emerged with their hands in the air. Captain Schwabe stopped talking about court-martials. Instead, he gave Guy official permission to operate alone. That had been 6 days ago. Now, on this morning of July 8th, Guy stood before Banzai Cliffs, facing a problem that no one thought he had any hope of solving. Hidden in the caves above were hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians. They had survived the failed Banzai charge. They still had weapons. They were desperate. And they were ready to die before they would ever consider surrender. The American command wanted to bring in flamethrower tanks to burn them alive. They wanted artillery to bring the caves down on top of them. Guy had something else in mind. He was going to walk right up to those caves by himself and talk them into surrendering. His tools? Broken Japanese and a bluff so reckless it just might succeed. If you're curious to find out how Guy's insane gamble played out, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does help us get more forgotten stories like this one out into the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. Alright, back to Guy's story. Guy grabbed hold of 2 Japanese prisoners he'd captured the previous day. He informed them they were heading back to the cliffs. They were going to go into those caves. Once inside, they would tell the soldiers that surrender was their only way out. The prisoners stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But at 7:30 inches the morning on July 8th, 1944, Guy Gabaldon began moving toward caves packed with hundreds of armed enemy troops who had been conditioned since they were children to never, ever surrender. Guy sent the 2 prisoners up the narrow path that led to the cave openings. He told them exactly what to say. The Americans had warships sitting just offshore, bombers circled overhead, tanks lined the beach. The fighting was finished. Surrender would bring them food, clean water, and medical care. No torture, no executions. Terms that allowed them to keep their honor. The prisoners began their climb. Guy stayed at the bottom of the cliffs. He could make out the cave openings roughly 50 yards above where he stood. Dark openings carved into the volcanic stone. He had no idea how many Japanese were hidden inside. Intelligence reports guessed anywhere from 200 to more than 1,000. No one knew the real number. The morning heat was already intense. The temperature had climbed past 80 degrees. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket. Guy kept his baseball cap on. His sunglasses stayed in place. His M1 carbine rested in his hands. 4 grenades hung from his belt. In his pockets he carried 45 rounds of ammunition. If the Japanese chose to fight back, his life expectancy was somewhere around 30 seconds, so he waited. The battle for Saipan had kicked off 23 days earlier. The Americans needed the island to serve as a launching point for their B-29 Superfortress bombers. Saipan sat just 1,300 miles away from Tokyo. That was close enough for the new long-range bombers to strike targets inside the Japanese home islands. The island had 2 functioning airfields. Japan had stationed 32,000 troops there to hold it. Another 20,000 civilians lived on the island as well. On June 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions came ashore. Japanese artillery opened fire from hidden positions built into the hills. Mortar shells rained down on the beaches before the Marines could even dig themselves in. That first day alone cost the Americans 2,000 casualties. The Japanese lost 5,000 men. But they continued fighting. General Holland Smith was in command of the invasion force. He warned his Marines that Saipan would be harder than Tarawa. He wasn't wrong. The Japanese defenders had constructed interconnected networks of caves, concrete pillboxes, underground tunnels, artillery emplacements hidden deep inside volcanic rock. Every single cave had to be cleared out using flamethrowers, grenades, and high explosives. By the time late June arrived, the Japanese understood they were beaten. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo found himself trapped on the island. He was the man who had commanded the carrier strike force during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now he watched as American forces pressed in from 3 separate directions. On the 6th of July, the Japanese commanders gave the order for one final assault. Every soldier, every sailor, Every officer who could still stand and walk was to take part. They would throw everything into one massive Banzai charge. The attack started at 4:00 the morning on July 7th. 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged straight toward American positions spread across the Tanapag Plain. They came at them with rifles, bayonets, and swords. Some had no weapons at all. They screamed as they ran directly into the line of American machine gun fire. The attack dragged on for 15 hours. By the time the sun set, 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The ones who survived pulled back to the caves along Banzai Cliffs and Marpi Point. Guy knew the numbers. He had seen what was left behind. In some spots, Japanese bodies were piled 3 men deep. American casualties had been heavy as well. The 27th Infantry Division alone had lost 650 men in that single engagement. The Japanese Banzai charge achieved nothing except mass death. Now the survivors sat in those caves, waiting for the end. Japanese officers had convinced their men that the Americans would commit unspeakable acts if they were captured. The propaganda had done its job. Civilians threw themselves off cliffs while holding their own children rather than face what they believed would come next. Marines discovered entire families dead at the bottom of Marpi Point. Mothers, fathers, infants. Guy waited at the base of Banzai Cliffs for a full 30 minutes. There was no movement coming from the caves, no gunfire, no grenades bouncing down the cliff path. He started to believe his plan had collapsed. Maybe the prisoners never even made it inside. Maybe the Japanese killed them the moment they appeared. Maybe no one believed the offer was real. Then he caught sight of movement. A single Japanese soldier stepped out from one of the cave entrances. Then another soldier appeared. Then 5 more. None of them were carrying weapons. They walked slowly down the cliff path, keeping their hands where they could be seen. Guy raised his carbine. He aimed it at the soldier in front. If this turned out to be some kind of trick, he'd fire first and die immediately after. But the soldiers kept moving forward. More began appearing behind them. 10 soldiers, 20, 30. They were emerging from multiple caves at once. Some of them carried wounded men. Others were helping civilians make their way down the steep path. Women, children, elderly men. They moved without making a sound. Guy lowered his weapon just a little. He shouted out in Japanese, "Get into a line, sit on the ground, do not try to run. If anyone runs, they will be shot." The soldiers did what he told them. They sat down on the ground at the base of the cliffs. More continued to come, 50, 70, 100. Guy suddenly understood he had a brand new problem on his hands. He was one Marine holding a carbine, and now he was surrounded by more than 100 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Some of the soldiers still had their weapons with them. Rifles slung across their shoulders, pistols tucked into their belts. They had agreed to surrender, sure, but if they decided to change their minds, there wasn't a thing Guy could do to stop them. He needed to stall for time. He told the soldiers to move away from the civilians. Then he ordered them to separate the wounded from those who were healthy. This caused confusion. People got to their feet. They moved around. They formed into new groups. The whole process ate up 15 minutes. And during those 15 minutes, even more Japanese kept pouring out of the caves. 200, 300, 400. Guy was now completely encircled by enemy soldiers on an exposed stretch of beach. No backup in sight. And more Japanese kept streaming down from the cliffs with every passing minute. Then a Japanese officer emerged from the largest of the cave entrances. He wore a complete uniform. A sword hung at his side. He walked down the cliff path by himself. The officer's posture was stiff and unmistakably military. He came to a halt about 20 feet away from Guy. The man appeared to be in his 42nds, maybe older. He had made it through the Banzai charge alive. That told Guy the officer was either incredibly fortunate or highly intelligent. Likely both. Guy lowered his carbine a bit but kept it at the ready. He began speaking in Japanese. He informed the officer that any further resistance was pointless. American forces had taken control of the island. The Imperial Navy had been crushed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea just 2 weeks prior. No help was on the way. If they kept fighting, everyone would die. If they surrendered, they would live. The officer's face gave nothing away as he listened. He asked what kind of treatment the prisoners could expect. Guy made his promise. Food, water, medical attention. No torture of any kind, no executions. The officer wanted to know if the soldiers would be kept apart from the civilians. Guy told him yes. The officer asked if the wounded would be given care. Guy said yes. The officer asked whether their personal belongings would be confiscated. Guy explained that weapons would be taken, but personal effects would not. The back and forth went on for about 10 minutes. While they talked, more Japanese continued to pour out from the caves. 500, 600. The beach was rapidly filling up with people. Soldiers gathered in clusters. Civilians pressed close together. Children began to cry. Their mothers did their best to keep them quiet. Old men just sat, staring at nothing. Guy pointed toward the American warships that could be seen sitting offshore. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships. He told the officer those vessels could reduce the cliffs to rubble in a matter of minutes. He gestured toward the sky where American fighter planes flew their patrol routes. He said the bombers would arrive next. The caves would turn into mass graves. The officer's eyes followed where Guy pointed. First to the ships, then to the aircraft overhead. Then back to Guy, an 18-year-old private in a baseball cap and aviator sunglasses. The officer gave a slight bow. He accepted the terms of surrender. He turned around and barked out orders in Japanese. Even more soldiers began climbing out of the caves. They came down in clusters of 10 and 20 at a time. Some of them were limping. Others carried wounded men on makeshift stretchers built from rifles and jackets. They made their way down the cliff paths, slowly and carefully. 700. 800. Guy now faced a problem that could get him killed. He had roughly 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians sitting on a stretch of beach. He was completely alone. He didn't have a radio. There was no way to call for help. He had no means of transporting prisoners. And there was a very real chance that Marine patrols might see this gathering and assume it was an enemy force preparing to attack, which would mean they'd open fire immediately. He had to get these prisoners back to American lines, and he had to do it quickly. But moving 800 people across 2 miles of contested ground was an impossible task for a single man. If the Japanese chose to scatter into the jungle, he couldn't stop them. If they decided to rush him, he'd be dead within seconds. If Marine patrols spotted this enormous group of people, they might shoot before asking any questions. Guy made his choice. He told the Japanese officer to get the prisoners organized into columns, soldiers at the front, civilians toward the back. The wounded in the middle. Keep the formations tight. No one runs, no one talks. If anyone breaks formation, they get shot. The officer passed the orders along. The Japanese began arranging themselves accordingly. While they got into position, Guy climbed up onto a rock. He stripped off his white undershirt. He tied it to a broken branch from a tree, a homemade flag of surrender. He handed it to a Japanese soldier standing in the front row. He gave the man clear instructions. Wave this flag constantly. Never stop. If American Marines see this flag, they won't fire. If you stop waving it, everyone here dies. The column started to move. 800 Japanese, 1 American. They walked north along the beach in the direction of American lines. Guy stayed at the very front of the column, right next to the man holding the flag. His carbine was visible in his hands, but he kept the barrel pointed toward the ground. He wanted any Marines who saw them approaching to recognize him as friendly, to see the surrender flag clearly, and to not perceive any kind of threat. They walked for about 20 minutes. The beach stretched out empty in front of them. No patrols anywhere, no vehicles, just volcanic sand and scattered gear left behind from the fighting. Guy kept glancing back over his shoulder. 800 people marching in formation behind him. If something went sideways, he'd be the first one to go down. Then he spotted them. 3 Marines on patrol roughly 300 yards up ahead. The moment they saw the column, they dropped into defensive positions behind rocks. One of them lifted a pair of binoculars to his eyes. Guy immediately started waving both arms over his head. He shouted out, "American! Friendly! These are prisoners! Do not shoot!" The Marines didn't lower their weapons. From where they stood, they could see a massive formation of Japanese troops moving straight toward them. The surrender flag was there, sure, but it was small. They had no way to confirm from that distance that Guy was actually American. They had no way of knowing this was a surrender instead of an attack. One of the Marines brought his rifle up. Guy watched him take aim. 800 Japanese troops walking in tight formation behind one undersized Marine wearing a baseball cap, the ideal target for an ambush. Guy kept shouting, in English this time, "American, Marine, prisoners. Do not shoot, do not shoot." The Marine held his rifle steady. His finger rested on the trigger. 800 prisoners. One very nervous Marine with a gun, and Guy standing right in the path of the first bullet if someone made the wrong call in the next 5 seconds. Guy didn't stop shouting. He ripped off his baseball cap and waved it in the air. The Marine holding the rifle wavered. He lowered the weapon just a fraction. Then he raised it again. The 2 other Marines shifted into better firing positions. They could clearly see hundreds of Japanese troops arranged in formation. Standard combat doctrine was straightforward. Open fire right away. Kill as many as you can before they have a chance to spread out. Guy stopped moving forward. He threw both hands straight up over his head. He turned his body to the side so the Marines could get a clear view of his uniform, American utility uniform. Marine Corps insignia visible. He shouted out his name, his rank, his unit, Private Guy Gabaldon, 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division. These are prisoners. Do not shoot. Finally, the Marine in front lowered his rifle. He stood up from his position behind the rocks. The other 2 stayed put with their weapons still ready. The lead Marine started walking forward, but he kept his distance. About 20 feet away, he asked Guy what in the hell was going on. Guy laid it out for him. 800 prisoners from Banzai Cliffs. They surrendered earlier this morning. He needed transport to get them to the prisoner holding area. The Marine stared at the column, then at Guy, then back at the column. He asked how one private managed to capture 800 Japanese soldiers. Guy explained it simply. He spoke to them in Japanese. He promised them food and medical treatment. He pointed at the warships sitting offshore. They believed what he told them. The Marine asked where Guy had learned to speak Japanese. Guy said East Los Angeles. The Marine told him that didn't make any sense. Guy agreed that it didn't. One of the Marines turned and sprinted back toward American lines to bring reinforcements. The other 2 stayed with Guy. Within half an hour, trucks rolled up. Marines from the 2nd Battalion arrived. Captain John Schwabe was with them. He took one look at the 800 prisoners sitting in formation on the beach. Then he looked at Guy. He asked what had happened. Guy gave him the rundown, walked to the cliffs, sent prisoners into the caves with an offer to surrender. The Japanese came out. He spoke with an officer. Marched them all back. Schwabe asked if Guy had any backup with him. Guy said no. Schwabe asked if he'd had a radio. Guy said no. Schwabe asked if he'd had authorization to carry out this operation. Guy replied, "Yes, sir. You gave me authorization to operate as a lone wolf 6 days ago." Schwabe didn't say anything to that. He gave orders to the Marines to secure the prisoners and get them transported to the holding area at Sharan Kanoa. It took 4 hours to process all 800 prisoners. Marines searched every single soldier. They confiscated weapons, knives, grenades, pistols. Some of the soldiers had carried sake bottles out from the caves. Personal belongings were recorded and then given back. Photographs, letters, religious objects. The Japanese were split into separate groups. Military personnel were separated from civilians. The wounded were sent to medical tents. Everyone else was loaded onto trucks for the ride out. American intelligence officers showed up to question the prisoners. They wanted details about any remaining Japanese forces. Defensive positions. How many troops were left? Command structure. The Japanese officer who had negotiated the surrender gave them detailed answers. He said there were roughly 2,000 Japanese soldiers still alive somewhere on Saipan. Most of them were hiding in caves in the northern section of the island. They were running low on ammunition. They had no food left, no medical supplies. They were simply waiting to die. The intelligence was extremely useful. It gave American commanders the information they needed to plan their final operations to sweep the island clean. The Marines now knew where to search, which caves to focus on, how many enemy combatants were still out there. The information likely saved American lives. But Guy never got any credit for it. His name didn't appear in the intelligence reports. By late afternoon on July 8th, all 800 prisoners had been secured. There were no incidents, no escape attempts, no violence. It was the largest single-day capture of prisoners by one individual in the entire history of the United States military, and most of the Marines stationed on Saipan never even heard about it. The story didn't make its way through the division. No press picked it up. No commendations were announced. It was just another day in the campaign. Guy went back to his unit. He cleaned his weapon, ate his sea rations, slept for 6 hours. The following morning he asked permission to go out again. Schwab gave his approval. There were more Japanese hiding in caves along the northern coastline, more chances to negotiate surrenders. Guy picked up his carbine and headed north. Over the next 3 weeks, Guy kept up his lone wolf operations. He brought in smaller groups, 15 prisoners here, 20 there, 30 somewhere else. Word about him started to spread among the Japanese troops. The short Marine who spoke rough Japanese and actually kept his word. Some groups even sent messengers asking for him by name. They would only surrender to Guy. Not to any other Marines, only him. By the time July came to an end, Guy had captured more than 1,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians, more than any other individual serving in the Pacific Theater. More than any soldier in any war America had ever fought. Captain Schwabe put his name forward for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was sent up to General Holland Smith. Smith looked it over. Then he downgraded it to a Silver Star. He gave no reason why. On the 1st of August, Guy and his unit were sent to Tinian. The island sat just 4 miles south of Saipan. The Marines were running cleanup operations there. Japanese holdouts were spread out across caves and patches of jungle. Guy started doing what he'd been doing, negotiating surrenders, talking to soldiers holed up in caves, making promises of fair treatment. On August 15th, Guy was out on patrol in the northern part of Tinian. He was hunting for Japanese holdouts. He came up to a cave entrance, called out in Japanese, made his offer to surrender. 3 Japanese soldiers stepped out into view. They pointed their rifles directly at him. Guy put his hands up. He started talking. Food, water, medical care, no torture. Then he heard it. The machine gun. Japanese machine gun fire erupted from his right side. Guy threw himself behind a fallen tree. Bullets shredded the vegetation just above his head. The 3 Japanese soldiers standing at the cave entrance broke in different directions. 2 of them ran back inside the cave. The 3rd one dropped his rifle and went down. He'd been hit by fire from his own machine gun position. Guy pressed himself flat behind the tree trunk. He could hear the machine gun swiveling back and forth, hunting for targets. The weapon was a Type 92 heavy machine gun, 7.7mm rounds. It could reach out to 800 meters effectively. The gun was firing from somewhere elevated, maybe 150 meters away. The gunner didn't have eyes on Guy behind the tree, but he was laying down fire in a sweeping pattern to keep anyone from moving. The patrol Guy was with had scattered the moment the shooting started. 5 Marines in total. Every one of them was pinned down behind rocks and trees. No one could move an inch without being completely exposed to that machine gun fire. The Japanese gunner knew what he was doing. He fired in short, controlled bursts, conserving his ammunition, waiting for someone to panic and break cover. Guy sized up the situation. The machine gun nest was way too far away for grenades, too well protected to take out with rifle fire. Trying to flank across open ground would be suicide. Standard Marine Corps training said to call in support. Mortars, artillery, maybe even an airstrike if you could get one. But this was just a small patrol. They didn't have a radio, no heavy weapons. Just 5 Marines with rifles going up against a fortified machine gun emplacement. The firing came to a stop. Silence settled in. The Japanese gunner was being patient. Guy stayed where he was behind the tree. Minutes crawled by. Nothing moved. The only sounds were insects buzzing and wind moving through the palm trees. Then the machine gun roared back to life. From a different angle this time, the gunner was shifting positions between bursts, trying to catch the Marines in new lines of fire. One Marine made an attempt to relocate. The machine gun spotted him instantly. Bullets smashed into the rocks close to where he was. He flattened himself to the ground and stayed put. The gunner fired off another burst, then stopped again, waiting. This was clearly a veteran crew. They understood how to lock down a position, how to keep the enemy pinned, how to wait for someone to make a mistake. Guy realized they were stuck in a tactical deadlock. The Japanese couldn't push forward without exposing themselves. The Marines couldn't pull back without having to cross open terrain. Nobody could go anywhere. And time favored the Japanese. They were dug into a fortified spot with ammunition and water. The Marines were out in the open with limited supplies. If this dragged on until nightfall, the Japanese could slip away or reinforcements might arrive for the Marines. But that was still hours off. Then Guy heard something moving behind him. Close by, he turned his head slowly. Spotted 3 Japanese soldiers crawling through the brush about 20 meters away. They were trying to circle around behind the Marine position. Moving through the jungle while the machine gun kept everyone's heads down. It was textbook infantry tactics. Pin them down with fire, flank with soldiers on foot, wipe out the trapped unit. Guy couldn't call out a warning to the other Marines without giving away where he was. He couldn't fire without tipping off the machine gun crew to his location, so he stayed perfectly still. He watched the 3 soldiers crawl closer. They moved with care, quietly. They had rifles and grenades with them. Their plan was obvious. Get within throwing range of the pinned-down Marines, lob explosives at them, then rush in with rifles. 15 meters, 10 meters. The soldier in front stopped moving. He lifted his head just a little, scanning for targets. He spotted one of the Marines crouched behind a rock about 30 meters ahead. The soldier made a hand signal to the others. He pointed. They started getting into position for the attack. One of the soldiers pulled a grenade off his belt. A Type 97 hand grenade, deadly out to about 10 meters. He got ready to throw it. Guy had to make a choice. He could shoot all 3 soldiers, kill them before any grenades got thrown. But doing that would alert the machine gun crew. They'd know exactly where the Marines were. They could concentrate all their fire, possibly kill everyone. Or he could let the grenades fly. Hope they missed. Hope the Marines made it through. Neither choice was a good one. He brought his carbine up. Aimed at the soldier holding the grenade. Fired 3 rounds. The soldier went down. The grenade slipped out of his hand. It rolled about 3 feet. Then it exploded. The blast killed the other 2 soldiers instantly, shredded the vegetation around them, created a thick cloud of smoke and dirt. The machine gun opened up right away. Bullets cut through the smoke, hit trees, ripped branches apart. Guy rolled to his left, getting behind a different tree. The machine gun tracked his movement, fired off a long, sustained burst. 20 rounds. 30. The gunner had lost his cool now. No more discipline. He was burning through ammunition. Guy could hear the Marines firing back, rifles cracking away, trying to keep the machine gun suppressed. Guy started moving again. He crawled through the undergrowth toward the cave entrance. The 3 Japanese soldiers he'd been trying to negotiate with were still inside. He made it to the entrance, stayed low. The machine gun was focused on the Marine patrol, not watching the cave. Guy shouted into the darkness in Japanese, "Surrender right now. Your machine gun crew is surrounded. All of you are going to die. Come out." No answer came back. He pulled a grenade off his belt, threw it into the cave. Small explosion. Smoke came pouring out. He heard coughing from inside. Movement. One soldier came stumbling out with his hands raised, then another. Both of them were wounded. Bleeding from grenade fragments. They collapsed right there at the cave entrance. Guy searched them. No weapons, no grenades. He dragged them away from the opening, applied pressure bandages from his first aid kit. The machine gun was still hammering away. The bursts were longer now. The crew was starting to panic, running low on ammunition, making errors. Then Guy felt the impact. His left leg, just above the knee. Sharp, stabbing pain. Then his leg went numb. He looked down. Blood was spreading through his utility trousers. Machine gun round, 7.7 millimeter, straight through. He'd been hit. Guy wrapped a tourniquet above the wound. Field first aid training kicking in. Stop the bleeding. Stay conscious. Keep fighting. The pain wasn't unbearable yet. Shock hadn't set in. He could still move, still think clearly. The machine gun kept firing at the Marine patrol. They were shooting back, keeping the gunner's head down. Guy started crawling toward the Marine positions. He dragged his wounded leg behind him, left a blood trail. 20 meters. 30. He reached the closest Marine, who was pressed up against a rock formation. The Marine saw the wound, started to put a better bandage on it. Guy pushed him away, said the machine gun had to be dealt with first. Otherwise, none of them were getting out alive. The Marine nodded. He signaled to the others. 3 Marines were still able to fight. 2 of them had picked up minor wounds from flying rock fragments. Guy told them the machine gun position was roughly 150 meters to the northeast. Elevated, clear fields of fire, veteran crew running it. They needed to either flank it or call in support. One of the Marines said they had no radio. No support was coming. They had to handle this themselves. Guy said he could try talking to them in Japanese, offer them a chance to surrender, maybe avoid the fight altogether. The Marine looked at Guy's leg, told him he wasn't walking anywhere. Guy agreed, said, "Just carry me closer. I'll negotiate from behind cover." 2 Marines lifted Guy up, stayed low, used trees and rocks to hide their movement. They pushed forward about 50 meters closer to the machine gun nest, close enough for Guy to shout and be heard, far enough away to avoid being overrun if things went bad. They set him down behind a large rock. Guy called out in Japanese. Laid out the situation for the machine gun crew. "You're surrounded, low on ammunition. No help is coming. Surrender is your only way out." The machine gun responded with a burst of fire. Bullets slammed into the rock. Ricochets screamed past overhead. The crew wasn't interested in talking. Guy tried again. He offered medical treatment, food, water, promised they'd be treated fairly according to the Geneva Convention. Another burst of fire came back. A longer one this time. The gunner was emptying what was left of his ammunition belt. While the machine gun stayed focused on Guy's position, the Marines made their move. 2 of them pushed through the heavy vegetation, used the terrain to their advantage, came at the position from the left side. The machine gun crew didn't spot them until they were about 30 meters out. The Marines threw grenades. 2 explosions went off. The machine gun went silent. The Marines rushed the position. They found 3 Japanese soldiers there. 1 was dead from grenade fragments. The other 2 were wounded. The machine gun was a Type 92 mounted on a tripod. Ammunition boxes were scattered all over the place. Empty belts everywhere. The crew had been almost out of rounds. They probably would have pulled back within the hour anyway. The Marines secured the 2 prisoners. Then they came back for Guy. His leg wound was bad. The bone hadn't been hit, but there was extensive damage to the muscle. He needed to be evacuated. Needed proper medical care. The patrol started heading back toward friendly lines. Guy was carried on a stretcher they put together using rifles and ponchos. The 2 Japanese prisoners from the cave walked along under guard. It took 2 hours to make it back to American positions. Guy was taken straight to the battalion aid station. A Navy corpsman cleaned the wound and dressed it properly, gave him morphine, checked for signs of infection. The bullet had gone clean through. No damage to arteries, no bone fragments, but the wound cut deep. Recovery was going to take months. Guy was loaded onto a truck, driven down to the beach, put on a landing craft, transferred out to a hospital ship anchored offshore. The ship set sail for Hawaii the following day. Guy spent 3 weeks in transit. His leg was healing. But slowly. Physical therapy was brutal. Walking was hard for him. The Navy doctor assured him he'd get full mobility back eventually. But his days of combat were done. He'd be receiving a medical discharge. While Guy was on board the hospital ship, Captain Schwaber put together his recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork came with witness statements from Marines who'd seen the 800 prisoners on July 8th, intelligence reports detailing the information gathered from interrogations, estimates of how many American lives had been saved thanks to intelligence from the prisoners, the total count of prisoners Guy had brought in, 1,300 soldiers and civilians, the largest single capture by one individual in all of United States military history. The recommendation was sent up the chain to General Holland Smith. He was the commander of all Marine forces throughout the Pacific campaign. Smith looked it over. He had the authority to either approve or reject Medal of Honor recommendations. He made his choice. He downgraded it to a Silver Star. No written explanation was attached. There was no appeal process in place. The decision stood as final. Some historians have tried to piece together why it happened that way. Guy was Mexican-American. Minority soldiers rarely got the top decorations during World War II. Or maybe Smith simply didn't believe that one private could have captured that many prisoners. Or perhaps he didn't think the intelligence value justified the highest honor. No one really knows for sure. Smith never spoke publicly about why he made that decision. Guy reached Hawaii in early September of 1944. He was moved to Aiea Naval Hospital, located near Pearl Harbor. His leg was coming along nicely. He could manage short walks with the help of a cane. Physical therapy kept going. The doctors believed he'd make a full recovery by December. After that, medical discharge. Guy would be heading back to civilian life at 18 years old. His war had come to an end, but the war itself kept going. American forces were pushing closer to Japan. More islands to take, more battles ahead. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. Guy read the reports while lying in his hospital bed, followed the progress of the campaigns. He wondered whether his methods could have saved more lives. Whether other Marines could have tried negotiating surrenders instead of always fighting to the death. One evening in late September, a Navy officer came to visit Guy in the hospital. He was carrying official documents. He informed Guy that he was being awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism on Saipan and Tinian. The medal would be presented in a formal ceremony once he'd recovered. Guy asked about the Medal of Honor recommendation. The officer said it had been reviewed and adjusted. No additional information was available. Guy accepted the Silver Star. He understood it was a significant decoration. Plenty of Marines never received any medals at all. But he also knew that capturing 1,300 prisoners was something that had never been done before. Actions that unprecedented usually got unprecedented recognition. Something had clearly gone wrong somewhere in the approval process, but there wasn't anything he could do to change it. In November of 1944, Guy was medically discharged from the Marine Corps. He went back to Los Angeles. His leg had healed up. He could walk on his own now, no assistance needed. But he walked with a permanent limp, and he carried memories that refused to go away. Guy came back to East Los Angeles in November 1944. He was 18 years old. He'd spent 5 months in combat. He'd captured more enemy prisoners than any American soldier in the history of warfare, and almost no one had any idea. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Same streets, same buildings, same people walking around. But Guy had changed completely. He had nightmares about the Banzai charge, about bodies piled up on the beaches, about civilians throwing themselves off cliffs. about that machine gun on Tinian. The memories didn't fade over time. If anything, they became sharper, more vivid. He tried reconnecting with old friends, but most of them were still overseas, fighting in Europe or somewhere in the Pacific. The ones who had come back didn't want to talk about combat. Nobody wanted to listen to war stories. Guy stopped bringing up Saipan, stopped mentioning the prisoners. People didn't believe him anyway. One Marine capturing 800 Japanese soldiers sounded like government propaganda, like something out of a Hollywood movie, not something that actually happened. In February of 1945, Guy received his Silver Star during a small ceremony held at the Federal Building in Los Angeles. A Navy officer handed him the medal, read the citation out loud, thanked him for his service. The entire ceremony lasted 15 minutes. No reporters showed up. No family photos were taken. Just Guy and the officer standing in an empty room. The war came to an end in August of 1945. Japan surrendered after atomic bombs leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Guy watched the celebrations that broke out across Los Angeles, people dancing in the streets, hugging complete strangers, crying tears of relief. Guy felt nothing, just emptiness inside. The war had ended, but the memories hadn't gone anywhere. Guy struggled to hold down work. His leg had healed, but the limp stayed with him for good. Employers didn't want to hire disabled veterans. He tried his hand at working in machine shops, construction sites, warehouses. Nothing ever lasted long. He kept moving around. Los Angeles, Mexico, Alaska, searching for something he couldn't put into words. In 1957, a television producer reached out to Guy. The show was called This Is Your Life. They wanted to tell his story on air. Guy said yes. The episode aired with Marine Corps veterans backing up his claims about the prisoner captures. The show reached millions of people watching at home. Suddenly, people started believing him. Letters poured in from all over the country. Veterans who had served on Saipan, relatives of Marines who'd been there, people writing to thank him for his service. Hollywood took notice. In 1959, Allied Artists Pictures started developing a film about Guy's time on Saipan. The movie was going to be called Hell to Eternity. Guy worked as a consultant while they were filming. He helped with the dialogue, corrected details to make them historically accurate, made sure the Japanese language sounded right. But Hollywood made changes. They cast an actor named Jeffrey Hunter to play Guy. Hunter stood 6 feet tall, blue eyes, Scottish-American background. Nothing at all like the 5'4" Mexican-American teenager who'd actually lived through the story. Guy objected. The studio told him Hunter was bankable. Audiences wanted a leading man who looked like a movie star, not someone who looked like the real Guy Gabaldon. The film came out in 1960. It did moderately well at the box office. Critics had good things to say about the action sequences. The film showed the Banzai charge, the prisoner captures, the lone wolf operations, but it cleaned everything up, made it more heroic, less messy than the reality had been. Guy went to the premiere. He said afterward that Jeffrey Hunter didn't look a thing like him, but at least the film brought attention to what had happened. 1 month after the film hit theaters, the Marine Corps made an announcement. They were upgrading Guy's Silver Star to the Navy Cross. That's the second highest military decoration for valor. The upgrade came 16 years after the original recommendation for the Medal of Honor. They didn't explain why the timing worked out that way. Most people assumed the publicity from the movie had pressured the Marine Corps into taking action. The Navy Cross ceremony took place in San Diego. Marine Corps Commandant General David Shoup presented the medal to Guy. Shoup had fought at Tarawa. He knew what the Pacific War had been like. He told Guy that his actions on Saipan had saved lives, both American and Japanese. That negotiation often took more courage than fighting. Guy deserved recognition. Shoup believed that, but questions still lingered. Why not the Medal of Honor? Guy had been put forward for it by his commanding officer. Witnesses had backed up the prisoner captures. Intelligence reports documented how valuable the information from those prisoners had been. 1,000, 300 prisoners was something that had never happened before. What more did the Marine Corps need to see? Some people pointed to racism. Mexican-American soldiers almost never received the highest decorations during World War II. Others argued the numbers just seemed impossible. That one Marine couldn't realistically capture that many prisoners. That Guy must have inflated the story. But the witnesses were crystal clear. The prisoners had been counted. The records were sitting in files somewhere. After he received the Navy Cross, Guy made a surprising choice. He moved to Saipan. He lived there for the next 20 years, built a business, raised a family, helped set up youth programs, became part of the local community. The island where he'd fought became the place he called home. Japanese tourists would sometimes recognize him. They'd thank him for treating their ancestors with respect during the war, for keeping his word about humane treatment. In 1990, Guy published a memoir. He called it Saipan, Suicide Island. The book laid out his experiences in detail: the prisoner captures, the negotiations, the combat, what came after. It sold a modest number of copies. Military historians used it as a reference source, but it never broke through to mainstream readers. For the rest of his life, Guy kept pushing for his Medal of Honor upgrade. He reached out to politicians, military officials, veterans organizations. He made his case over and over. His actions met every criteria for the award. Politics or prejudice had gotten in the way. Justice delayed was justice denied, but the recommendation never made it past the initial review stages. In 2005, Guy received the Chesty Puller Award from the World War II Veterans Committee. The award was created to recognize Marines who'd shown extraordinary heroism but hadn't received proper recognition for it. It wasn't the Medal of Honor, but it was an acknowledgement that something had gone seriously wrong with the original recommendation process. Guy Gabaldon died on August 31, 2006. He was 80 years old. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His Navy Cross went with him, his Silver Star, his Purple Heart, but not the Medal of Honor he believed should have been his. Guy Gabaldon's methods fundamentally changed how the United States military thought about capturing prisoners. Before Saipan, the common belief was that Japanese soldiers would never surrender under any circumstances, that every cave had to be cleared out with flamethrowers and explosives, that trying to negotiate was a waste of time. Guy proved all of that wrong. After the war ended, military analysts took a close look at his techniques. They studied how he used language, how he made promises and then actually kept them, how he built trust by being consistent. The analysis went on to influence psychological operations training, interrogation techniques, procedures for handling prisoners. The military began to understand that cultural knowledge could be just as valuable as raw firepower. But Guy never got full recognition while he was alive. The Medal of Honor question stayed with him. He spent decades trying to get the upgrade. He contacted every Marine Corps commandant who served from 1960 all the way through 2005. He wrote letters to Congress, showed up at veteran events, told his story again and again, always hoping someone would finally listen, always hoping justice would come through. In 1998, several of the Marines who'd served with Guy on Saipan started a campaign to get his Navy Cross upgraded to the Medal of Honor. They tracked down witness statements, located old intelligence reports, built up documentation showing the real impact his prisoner captures had made. The campaign picked up support from Hispanic veteran organizations, from military historians, from members of Congress. The recommendation made it all the way to the Secretary of the Navy. Then it stopped moving forward. The problem came down to time. Medal of Honor recommendations operated under strict deadlines. They had to be submitted within 3 years of the action taking place. Guy's original recommendation had been downgraded back in 1944. By 1998, that window had closed 54 years earlier. The law didn't allow for exceptions. The people advocating for Guy argued the rule was fundamentally unfair, that Guy had been denied proper recognition because of prejudice or bureaucratic error, that the extraordinary circumstances should warrant making an exception, but the Department of Defense held firm. No matter how deserving someone might be, the timeline had run out. The decision stood as final. Some military historians have raised questions about whether Guy really did capture 800 prisoners in a single day. Lieutenant Robert Cheeks, a Marine Japanese language officer who'd also served on Saipan, expressed doubts in interviews he gave later in life. He suggested Guy had exaggerated the numbers, that many of the prisoners were civilians, not combat soldiers, that other Marines had helped with the capture, but never got any credit for it. But the official records back up Guy's version of events. The Navy Cross citation specifically mentions over 1,000 prisoners. Captain John Schwabe's recommendation describes the 800 captured on July 8th. Intelligence reports make reference to information gathered from mass surrenders. Multiple Marines witnessed that column of prisoners on the beach that day. The documentation is there. The numbers have been verified. What can't be argued is that Guy developed methods that actually worked, that he saved lives on both sides of the fighting, that he proved negotiation could succeed in situations where violence would have just meant more death, that his courage showed itself not through killing, but through taking enormous risks. Walking alone toward enemy positions required a completely different kind of bravery, the kind that military culture has historically struggled to value properly. Today, there's a memorial plaque honoring Guy Gabaldon at the American Memorial Park on Saipan. The plaque talks about his prisoner captures, his methods, the impact he had. Japanese tourists stop by the site to visit. Some leave flowers behind. Some leave notes thanking him for treating their grandfathers with dignity when they surrendered. In 2018, documentary filmmakers tracked down and interviewed the last surviving members of Guy's unit. The Marines backed up his story completely. They described watching him walk toward caves by himself, seeing him come back with hundreds of prisoners. They said Guy never boasted about what he'd done, never went looking for glory. He just did what felt right to him. And then he lived with how things turned out. The United States Marine Corps now teaches Guy's methods as part of cultural awareness training courses. Future Marines learn about psychological operations, about building rapport with enemy combatants, about the strategic value of taking prisoners instead of killing everyone, about how one teenager with broken Japanese managed to save thousands of lives through courage and creativity rather than through firepower alone. If this story connected with you the way it connected with us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to push this story out to more people who need to hear it. Go ahead and hit subscribe while you're at it. Turn on notifications too. We're pulling forgotten stories out of dusty archives every single day. Stories about Marines who saved lives armed with broken Japanese and an outrageous bluff. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada? Our community spreads across the entire world. You're not just watching. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the military. Just let us know you're here with us. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Guy Gabaldon doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.